From MTN News, this is the debate for Montana's 2nd Congressional District. Now, here's tonight's moderator, Tim McGonigal.
Good evening, and thanks for joining us across Montana tonight. I'm Tim McGonigal. Welcome to Montana's Eastern District U.S. House debate on the Montana television networks. We'll be with you for the next hour, commercial-free. Let's now meet our candidates for tonight's debate. We'll start with the incumbent. It's Republican Matt Rosendale. He was elected in 2020 with over 56% of the vote and won the June primary with 75% of the vote over the challengers Kyle Austin, Charles Walkingchild, and James Boyette. We move on to our Democratic candidate. That's Penny Ronning of Billings. Penny is a former Billings City Council member and defeated Billings resident Skylar Williams in this year's primary. She won with over 58% of the vote. And the independent candidate this year is Billings businessman Gary Buchanan. He founded Buchanan Capital in 2002. Gary served as the first director for the Montana Department of Commerce under Democratic Governor Ted Schwinden and led a major effort to reorganize state government under Republican Mark Roscoe. We want to go over the format for today's debate. It will be a direct question to a candidate from one of our panelists. The candidate will have 60 seconds to answer. That will be followed by a 30-second rebuttal from the second and third candidate, and then the first candidate receives the final 30 seconds to respond to the rebuttal. If a panelist feels the first candidate didn't understand or answer the question, the panelist can ask a follow-up or clarifying question. And at the conclusion of the debate, each candidate will have 90 seconds for a closing statement. A random drawing decided the order of today's questions, and Mr. Gary Buchanan will receive the first question. He'll make the first closing statement as well. Candidate Penny Ronning will receive the second question and second closing, and candidate Matt Rosendale will have the third question and final closing statement. Before we get started, let's take a minute to meet the panelists for tonight's debate. We'll start with Russ Riesinger. Russ is a Billings native. He has spent more than 3 decades in television, covering just about everything imaginable. He returned home to Montana in October of 2018 to become the evening anchor for KTVQ in Billings. Next, we have Ashley Nurbevig. Ashley is a senior political reporter with MTN, and before switching to broadcasting, she spent many years covering politics for publications like the Detroit Free Press, the Marshall Project, and most Montana papers. And finally, again, I'm Tim McGonigal. I'll be a panelist as well as the moderator for tonight's debate. I joined KRTV in Great Falls and KXLH in Helena in 2008, and I'm currently the 5:30 and 10 o'clock anchor for each station. I grew up in Helena, working in radio for several years before breaking into TV. All right, it's time now to get on to our first question. And as we said, Mr. Gary Buchanan, you have the first question, and I will ask it. You've been running, you're running as an independent, but our understanding is that you won't caucus with either party. However, you have been endorsed by Montana's 2 biggest unions, which traditionally back Democratic candidates. So what would you say to those who say that you would sway to the Democratic side?
First of all, Tim, I haven't met you. Nice to meet you. And Russ and Ashley, good to see you again. Is it okay? Penny and I call each other by our first names. Matt, is that okay that we use first names? Thank you. I filed as an independent the last day you could file. Been an independent for 43 years. Served 6 governors, as you mentioned. I think an independent has an opportunity. I will not, at this point, caucus with either Republicans or Democrats. I'm not happy with the leadership of either one. You do not have to join a caucus, Republican or Democrat. I want to wait and see what the leadership looks like after the next legislature before I commit. There are dozens of caucuses on Capitol Hill, and I will do and caucus with what's best for Montana.
All right. Ms. Ronning, your 30-second rebuttal.
Well, I guess I would say that's a throwaway vote, Montanans. And I think it's required that for you to vote fairly, that Mr. Buchanan should identify who he plans to caucus with before the ballots are sent out.
All right, thank you. And Congressman Rosendale, your rebuttal.
I think we have to look at where the rubber meets the road and look at where everybody stands on these policies. And Mr. Buchanan, Gary, has already come out and made it pretty clear that he supports the ban of semi-automatic rifles here in Montana, which most of the people across the state would have a very, very big problem with. He certainly was supportive of the big government spending and actually came out and publicly said he wanted to support the additional 87,000 IRS agents. So I see he's a Democrat, whether he claims to be or not.
All right, thank you. And Mr. Buchanan, you have 30 seconds for a
You know,
rebuttal.
truly an independent. Ask the Republican and Democrat governors that I've served. I assume we'll get into guns later. I'm a strong Second Amendment supporter. I own firearms. I have a hunting and fishing license. I have not called for confiscation of any kind of weapon or assault weapon. I'm strong on the Second Amendment, and I'm not tied to either party. I'm truly and actually an independent.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan. Russ Riesinger has the next question to Penny Ronning.
Ms. Ronning, state legislators here in Montana have proposed right-to-work legislation. Well, at the national level, there was a bill just recently introduced in the U.S. Senate that would nullify all right-to-work laws. Where do you stand on the issue of right-to-work laws, and why?
Thank you for that question, Russ. So those folks that know me well know that I am a former union member and that I'm a strong union supporter. I'm happy and thrilled to announce that I've been endorsed by the SMART Division Union and that sheet metal, air, railway, and transit. I strongly believe in union workforce and believe that that's the way we build our economy again, is that we invest in the American worker. So I will support unions, I do now, and will continue in the future.
Congressman Rosendale, your rebuttal.
Sure. I think the most important thing to remember is if we don't have any jobs, you can't organize. And the policies of the Democratic Party have been sending jobs out of our country for decades now. We finally, under the Trump administration, were able to bring them back again. And so that is where my focus is going to be. As far as right-to-work laws and legislation, I think all of that should be handled at the state level. And most of my work has been to try and restore federalism and allow the state to function the way that they're supposed to.
All right, and Gary Buchanan, your rebuttal.
I'm a businessman. I've started my investment career 43, almost 44 years ago. I speak to business people all over the state, including chambers of commerce. I'm against right to work. I'm for collective bargaining. I've noticed that the Republican legislators themselves don't want to deal with the issue, and I don't see any issue at the state level that is proposing right to work, but I would be against it.
And Penny Ronning, you get the final word on this question.
Thank you. So actually the economic policies that moved jobs overseas came from the 1980s under Ronald Reagan. And I think that's important to always remember, is that Democrats have been the strong supporters of unions and union wages that lift the wages of all American workers.
Thank you. Ashley Nurbevig, you have the next question to Congressman Matt Rosendale.
Hi, Congressman. Do you support the Republican bill in Congress to create a national ban on abortion after 15 weeks with exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother? And if so, how close to death does a woman need to be before an abortion is appropriate?
Thank you, Ashley. I do appreciate that question. We've watched for 50 years as the Supreme Court decision of Roe v. Wade allowed for abortions to be performed across the states without the states being able to have any kind of real true control over those decisions. And finally, the Supreme Court in the Dodd v. Jackson case was able to return this rightfully back to the states. I think that each state is going to address this issue differently. I think that we'll probably see a lot of things play out in the courts over the next 10 years, because we will see states that will have very, very restrictive abortion laws, and then we're going to have states that literally, right now, they allow abortion up until the moment that a child is born, and that is very troubling. I myself am 100% pro-life. I feel that there's two victims in every abortion, the mother and the child, and I would certainly think that every physician in that case would do everything he could to save both of those lives.
And Mr. Gary Buchanan, you have a rebuttal.
I had one of Matt's statewide elected officials ask me what an independent is. And I told him an independent is keeping the Democrats out of your wallet and the Republicans out of your bedroom. I'm pro-choice. I'm pro-privacy. I think the Montana Constitution is about to become under attack, and the government should stay out of women's lives.
Thank you. Penny Ronning, your rebuttal.
Thank you. So I am a believer that abortion is health care, and that whether it's state government, local municipal government, or federal government, that any form of government does not have the right and should not have the right to decide what is best for a woman and her body. That should be the choice between that woman and her medical provider over what is the best medical decision. But even then, the choice is strictly up to the person who is pregnant over their own medical choice.
Thank you, Ms. Ronning. And Mr. Rosendale, you have the final 30 seconds.
Thank you very much, Tim. Again, I'd just like to reiterate, this is something that has been turned over to the states. I'm glad, I think rightfully so, it was turned over to the states. I do believe, to reiterate, that there are two victims in this situation. We have a mother and we have a child. I support the pregnancy crisis centers all across the state to make sure that we can continue to nurture both of them as they move forward.
And I believe, Ashley Nurbevig, you have a follow-up.
Yeah, I'd just like to clarify. Do you believe that it is more important to allow a pregnancy to continue even if it threatens the life of the mother for the chance of the child to live? Or do you believe that a woman can decide how far she'd like to risk her life for a pregnancy?
Again, when it comes to a situation where you have this issue to reconcile, I believe that is something between the woman and her doctor. It's going to be, but we do have two lives. Let's not mistake it. There are two lives there that are in jeopardy, and I think we need to do the best that we can to preserve both of those lives.
All right. Russ Riesinger to Gary Buchanan.
Yeah, Mr. Buchanan, we're going to stay on the topic of abortion for just a second. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you came to your beliefs on abortion?
Well, my wife and I have supported Planned Parenthood for probably 20 years. I find it ironic that Lindsey Graham now, Matt, you're talking about it being states' rights, that Lindsey Graham wants to now make it a federal issue. I think there are state right factors, but if Lindsey Graham is going to vote and codify anti-abortion laws at the state level, I would, if I was in Congress, vote to codify Roe versus Wade.
And Ms. Ronning, your rebuttal.
Thank you. In the history of our country, men have never been held legally responsible for the pregnancy that a woman has. A woman has been completely responsible for that pregnancy financially all the way around. And there's just no equality there, and it's time that we start talking about reproductive equality in a serious nature, in a serious conversation.
Mr. Rosendale.
Thank you, Tim. I find it fascinating that we have all this technology and we can see that this is a living being. We have a separate DNA, a unique and separate DNA as soon as that child is conceived. If we found a one cell living on Mars with all the telescopes that we have, it would go around the world as being proclaimed, we found life on Mars. I just don't understand why we don't do the same thing in a woman's womb.
Thank you. And Mr. Buchanan, you have the final rebuttal here.
I think women's right, human rights in general are a critical part. I think they're under attack at the state level, and I think they're under attack at the national level. And I think the government should stay out of women's lives and people's lives in general.
Thank you. Ashley Nurbevig, you have the next question to Penny Ronning.
Yes. A lot of people here in the United States have lost faith in the election process, even though there was no evidence of widespread fraud. What can be done to restore faith in our elections?
It's a great question. And my answer is that we need to start believing in one another again. And I realize that we're at a news station here and we're being interviewed by media. But I also think that we need to re-examine the Fairness Act, and that we need to understand that what we watch on TV has changed since the Fairness Act, again under the Reagan years, was eliminated. And our news has become more about punditry than it really has been about the delivery of real news. The real news is that there was no election fraud, that our election workers are our neighbors. Those are the folks that we live with in our own community, and it's time we start trusting our community again.
Congressman Rosendale, you have a 30-second rebuttal.
I really think that we need to make sure that we maintain the control of our elections at the state level. It is critically important. We have seen after the last election cycle that no less than 6 states have proposed new election laws to make sure that they can assure election integrity. Right here in Montana, we passed 4 more election laws supported by the Secretary of State, Christy Jacobson. They were challenged in courts. They've been verified, reasserted by the courts, and that's the way we're going to assure that.
Thank you. And Mr. Buchanan, you have a rebuttal.
I think fraud is a false issue. I mean, Joe Biden won fair and square, and Republicans in Montana won fair and square. And I've never seen such winners whine about winning so much. I submitted my crew submitted 15,000 signatures, 456 of them. And we were convinced that the election offices, which are under attack now from the state and federal level, were honest and complete, and there was no fraud.
Thank you. And Ms. Ronning, you have the final rebuttal.
Thank you. I was raised to believe in government and to respect government. That includes our election workers. And I do believe that they do their job, and they do their job very well. It's a hard job, but they do their job well. And I think that our elections have proven that we have the best country in the world when it comes to democracy and how we vote.
On to the next question. It's from me to Congressman Matt Rosendale. And Congressman, you have voted against just about every clean energy initiative before Congress. Do you not think the federal government or America should be doing anything to combat climate change?
What I absolutely believe, Tim, is that we are doing a lot to address climate change, and that the best way for us to do that is to make sure our businesses who have the best innovation and technology available to them are the ones that are able to pursue it. What I don't believe is that we should put additional regulations on our businesses to keep them from being able to compete equally with the rest of the businesses across and industries across the globe. Everyone wants clean air, everyone wants clean water, and everyone wants clean, safe communities. I hosted an energy tour about 2 months ago with many of my colleagues from Congress, and we looked at one of the refineries in Laurel. We looked at the palladium mine in Stillwater. We looked at the Colstrip coal mine, and we also looked at the wind farm just north of Miles City. But the fact is that that wind farm north of Miles City would not even be feasible if the regulations hadn't closed down the 2 power plants in Colstrip and provided a $30 million rebate from the federal government to make that wind farm possible.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Gary Buchanan, your rebuttal.
I have served agricultural and business clients for 43 years. I don't find any more climate change deniers. There used to be deniers. I think every farmer, rancher, and businessman, businesswoman in the state believes in climate change. There are some impressive things going on. The Calumet refinery here I met with the other day. And while they're producing diesel and gasoline, which I think we need for quite a while, they're also expanding a $100 million plus renewable diesel effort. So we're making progress on it, but we've got a long, long ways to go.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan. Ms. Ronning, your response.
Thank you. So climate change is real, and it is something we have to address. We only have to look at Florida today and the recent flooding that we had in south central Montana to understand that climate change is real, and we do need to be aggressive in how we go after this and how we turn the tide on this. I just met last night with the Montana Petroleum Association and learned what the refineries are doing to improve their aspect and their fight in climate change. So I see that technology has helped in this fight, even within our refineries and with our coal plants. And I'm excited about things that are happening within agriculture and the way the state of Montana is addressing climate change.
Thank you, Ms. Ronning. And Congressman Rosendale, your final rebuttal.
Again, everyone wants clean air. We want clean water. We want safe and clean communities, and we're doing that. And our businesses and industries are doing it better than anyone. What I'm really pleased to see is that we're finally starting to investigate the opportunities with nuclear energy again. We haven't even looked at that for about 40 years, and the advances that have taken place can literally give us the ability to build micro plants close to communities so that we have a zero carbon footprint and zero emissions, and that's a good thing.
Thank you. Ashley Nurbevig, you have the next question to Gary Buchanan.
Yeah, and again, staying on the topic of climate change, can you talk a little bit about how we balance the priorities of climate change with economic priorities, in particular in somewhere in eastern Montana where there is so much opportunity for oil and gas drilling?
Well, I come from Billings, which is an oil and gas town in a lot of ways. I think for the foreseeable future, at least for the next 3 or 4 years, I think we need to continue to drill oil and gas. I think we need to stay energy independent. I don't want tanks in Ukraine running out of gas, and I don't want to see a spike up in gasoline again. But we have to be serious. I led the Clean Water Initiative several years ago. My house was vandalized by a gold mining group, and my business was boycotted. So I'm a champion of clean water. I've received a number of national awards for my effort. So I have the credentials, I think, to continue to lead from an environmental standpoint. But in the meantime, we have to have energy independence, and that's why I'm so impressed with, like Penny has just said, impressed with the way refineries have started to move to some new renewable sources.
Penny Ronning, your rebuttal.
Thank you. Well, I led in the City of Billings Energy Conservation Board, and I'm very proud to say that Billings has been recognized as one of 120 cities nationwide as leading the way in energy conservation and the work that we're doing. I do think that we can look to our agriculture, which is so predominant in Congressional District number 2, and the work that they're doing in regard to climate change. It's truly impressive, and I think we only need to look to agriculture as leading the way.
Congressman Rosendale.
Thank you so much. We cannot ignore the need for base load power generation. In February of 21, we had a terrible storm rage from Canada all the way down to Texas, and it froze the wind turbines. There was no wind blowing, and we had major outages from one end of the country to the other. I happened to be in Macomb County and spoke with the Macomb County Co-op, electric co-op, that very day, and they literally had a blackout, a time blackout, because of the participation they had with the other co-ops, and we cannot have that.
Thank you. And Mr. Buchanan, your response.
I think we absolutely need wind and solar energy and other forms of energy. I just met recently with a union member. I went down to Colstrip, and I think Colstrip is in a transition. Even the union members down there, part of the AFL-CIO that endorsed me, realizes that we are in a transition, that we're eventually going to have to do without coal power. Right now, I think we need it, and I hope when we move on to renewable energy and we move on to cleaning up the ash ponds at Colstrip, that we hire the workers that are in Colstrip now to help move Colstrip ahead in terms of helping its future economy.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan. My question now is to Penny Ronning, and as we've seen, wildfire season in Montana isn't just during the summer months anymore. Do you think that the federal government should be doing anything different to manage forest fires?
Thank you for that question. And speaking of fires, I want to extend my heartfelt condolences to the city of Great Falls for the recent loss of your firefighter, Michael Kuntz. My heart goes out to his family and to all of the firefighters here. Yes, absolutely, there are things that we can be doing to address the forest fires, and that also comes back to what we were just talking about in regard to climate change. Those are things that we need to be addressing because we're seeing those weather patterns throughout the country, whether it's lightning or whether it's human-caused. These are things that we need to be addressing at the government level in regard to resources that we're providing at the state level, the municipal level, and to the actual firefighters doing the job.
Congressman Rosendale.
Thank you so much. What we have to do is have much better forest management practices. I introduced legislation last year, 2 pieces. One for the FUR Act to make sure we could overturn the Cottonwood decision, which starts the clock over time and time again when people are litigating these forest timber sales. And the other was the Forest Management Litigation Act to make sure that we could basically work on trying to clean up some of the guarantees that were put in place by the Equal Access to Justice laws. Right now, we have 28 different forest sales tying up 30,000 acres of quality timber that could be harvested.
Thank you, Mr. Rosendale. Mr. Buchanan, your rebuttal.
I think what we can, in terms of fire, I mean, just yesterday, Matt, you voted against a bill that had money for fire protection, as well as helping Ukraine. And I think sometimes you got to vote what you think and vote for what you say say here.
Thank you. And Ms. Ronning, your final rebuttal.
Thank you. I would like to remind Mr. Rosendale that he voted against protection for federal firefighters. He's voted against almost every single piece of legislation when it comes to actually helping Montana. Whether he introduces legislation or not, the important thing is he's got to be able to get something out of a committee, and he's not been able to do that. So to say he's introduced legislation, I think is null and void to the subject.
Russ Riesinger, you have a question now for Congressman Rosendale.
Yeah, Congressman, do you support an investigation into the meat packers for price fixing? And should Congress do more, if anything, to help our ranchers get a fair price for their cattle?
Thank you so much, Russ. I think this goes directly to a lot of the inequities that are taking place, not only within the country and the big businesses that are controlling those sales, the four big packers, but also the trade agreements that we haven't been able to get negotiated for some of the trade going overseas. I've been supportive of and introduced a very similar law to the Coal Labeling Act to make sure that when people go into the grocery store, they can actually look down and see a piece of beef that was born, raised, and butchered right here in Montana, right here in the United States. We raise the best beef in the world, and I am very certain that people would select that before something that was brought in from someplace else. But we have to get that legislation, and unfortunately, the four big packers have been controlling all that, and I absolutely would support investigating to see how they were able to do so.
Thank you. Mr. Buchanan, your response.
Well, I think a U.S. Congressperson can initiate antitrust performance. We have four companies that control the grain price, 85% of it. And we have four packing companies that control 90% of beef. I'm for country of origin labeling, and I'm also for a program that will put more investigators, attorneys in the Department of Agriculture to oversee some of this problem that's very widespread.
Thank you. And Ms. Ronning, your response.
Thank you. I am for country of origin labeling as well, and am for the family farmer and rancher. We've lost too many of our family farmers and ranchers already due to the fact that they don't have a fair price in the marketplace right now. Do I agree with investigators searching and researching into the meatpacking situation? I absolutely do. We have to get back to where our family farmers and ranchers are able to produce the quality of beef that we know Montana has.
Thank you. Congressman Rosendale, your 30-second response.
Sure. This is another demonstration of why this one-party control over Washington, D.C., the Democrats, they've got control of the White House, the Senate, the House of Representatives, where a lot of stuff doesn't get through. In the state legislature, we were used to every single bill receiving a hearing, but we don't have that luxury in the United States House of Representatives. The Democrats have complete control over that, and they're the ones that are keeping this from happening. And as far as having additional investigators, we know that Gary would like to have additional investigators. He voted for or supported 87,000 more IRS agents.
Thank you. My next question is to Gary Buchanan. And Mr. Buchanan, we've just endured the COVID-19 pandemic. So in your mind, what, if anything, can Congress do to be better prepared the next time this happens?
Well, I think we're unprepared now. I think at both the federal and state level, we have to quit attacking health professionals. In Billings, a senior senator of Matt's party recently visited with young doctors. And he stood up and he accused these young doctors of falsifying death certificates to raise money for the hospitals. He went on to say that kale, the vegetable, K-A-L-E, was better than the Merck therapeutic. The hospitals in this state fell under attack by national government and state government. The two hospitals, I served on both hospital boards in Billings, have had to triple their security costs because of the anger that the national and state governments are creating against health care. That's got to stop.
Thank you. Ms. Ronning, your rebuttal.
Thank you. While I was serving on Billings City Council, I was privileged to be part of a weekly conversation with different members of the White House administration on the pandemic. And every week I got to hear from different department directors within the White House and the administration on how COVID was being handled at the time. And at the time during those conversations, there were definitely differences of opinions just within the White House alone. So when it comes to government, it's time that government starts actually communicating with one another at all different levels, and that we also are a country that believes in science. Science has been remarkable in what we've been able to discover and what we've been able to do as a country, and we need to trust that that's what we're doing within our medical professionals as well.
Thank you. And Mr. Rosendale, your
Thank
response.
you, Tim. When the pandemic first came out, I was acting as the insurance commissioner for Montana, and I had to send 60 of my 65 employees home to work from home, and we were able to do that and still manage all of our work. But the next thing I did is I came in every day was to contact daily with the insurance companies and with the providers to make sure that we could keep people healthy, that we could distribute the care that they needed. And we did all of that without a single mandate. What we did learn is that we have to focus more on treatments and that we have to focus more on making sure that the PPE and the other products that we need to address any of this are manufactured right here in the United States.
Thank you. And Mr. Buchanan, your response.
The last legislature passed House Bill 702, which I think has hurt every hospital and health provider in the state. We have regional public health officials and county public officials resigning because of this attack. 702 actually told me as a business person that I can't quarantine people, that I can't require even measles, mumps, chickenpox vaccine. It was a misguided attempt. The governor of South Dakota and the governor of Idaho vetoed this kind of nonsense, and that bill has really hurt this state.
Thank you. Russ Riesinger, you have the next question to Penny Ronning.
Yeah, Ms. Ronning, the pandemic and other stressors have caused a real spike in mental illness. And we know Montana already has an alarming suicide rate, particularly among our veterans. What more can Congress do to help with this problem?
Thank you for that question. Mental health, we have to start destigmatizing the conversation of mental health, the idea of mental health, and understand that it is a medical concern just like cancer, just like diabetes, and we have to start funding it just like the other issues that I just mentioned. Mental health in regard to, oftentimes we hear about the southern border from Mr. Rosendale and the threat of the southern border. Well, the reality is that mental health and substance abuse right here in our own state is what needs to be addressed and what needs to be adequately funded to reduce crime, to reduce the substance abuse addiction that we see prevalent within our country and within our state. If we adequately fund treatment programs like we fund cancer, like we fund diabetes, like we fund liver illness, we can start to address mental health issues.
Thank you. Congressman Rosendale, your response.
Sure. I served on a private mental health agency for their board of directors for several years. So I saw a very full spectrum of mental health problems and conditions, from people that just had a chemical imbalance that was triggered when they became an adolescent to people that had substance abuse problems that caused these issues. So I've seen a lot of different things. When I was the state auditor, I supported parity in mental health treatment with physical conditions, and I've in Congress supported several pieces of legislation to make sure that we can get adequate mental health treatment out to the community.
Thank you. Mr. Buchanan, your response.
I attended the suicide walk and supported it for a 3 years. I had a direct problem because I lost both my mother and my sister to suicide. It's been a long time. The pain still stays, and I enjoy helping people try to get through the phase of coming around for it. I think the mental health situation at the state hospital is a crisis, and I think it should be addressed as a crisis and not just postponed till next year. Suicides are far more suicides than there are overdoses from drugs in Montana, and it has to be dealt with.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan. And Ms. Ronning, your response.
Thank you. It's easy to say that we can sit on boards or we've addressed issues with legislation, but we still have the problem of being too high in the numbers here in Montana. We've been number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for over 40 years when it comes to suicide in our state. And it's time we actually start addressing it with action and not just talk.
Thank you. And Ashley Nerbervig, you have a question for Congressman Matt Rosendale.
Mr. Rosendale, do you support giving Medicare the power to bargain for prescription drugs, and why or why not?
I do, and I'll tell you, the prescription drug problem, again, when I was the insurance commissioner, I did an incredible amount of research to find out why was the prescription drug portion of our healthcare growing faster than any other segment. And what we discovered was there's these brokers that participate in the middle between the insurance companies and the pharmacist and the consumer and the actual drug manufacturers. They're called pharmacy benefit managers, and they are taking billions and billions of dollars out of the industry and not providing any service for that whatsoever. We also discovered that they literally are bound because of these secret contracts that are keeping us from going in and exposing it. I tried very hard at the state level to expose this information. I was able to get legislation passed through. The governor vetoed it. Governor Bullock vetoed it at the time. So we're working right now to do the same thing at the federal level.
Thank you. And Mr. Buchanan, your response.
I voted against Build Back Better because I thought it was too inflationary. But I do like what ended up, which is the bill, I think it's misnamed because I don't think it has much to reducing inflation. But it has 85% or so for climate change. And then it's voted, part of that bill helps prescription drugs. And I think that Medicare should be able to negotiate prices, competitive prices on key drugs.
Thank you. Ms. Ronning, your response.
Thank you. Yes, I do believe that Medicare should have the opportunity and should have the right to negotiate prescription drug prices. And I'd like to remind Mr. Rosendale that he's voted against every single bill that has ever come before Congress in regarding reducing the price or capping the price at insulin.
Thank you. And Mr. Rosendale, your final word here.
Price fixing doesn't work. It just doesn't. And what we have to do is go to the root of the problem. And the root of the problem are the pharmacy benefit managers. And we've seen that they take billions of dollars out of these transactions. There's 3 pharmacy benefit managers that have control over 85% of the prescription drugs across our country. We've identified them as the problem, and I just need more help in Congress to resolve this issue. Again, Democrat full control over Congress, Senate, White House, hard to get it through.
Thank you. Russ Riesinger, you have the next question. It goes to Gary Buchanan.
Yeah, Mr. Buchanan, many states, including Montana, have now legalized recreational marijuana. Would you support legalization at the federal level? Why or why not?
Well, I actually voted against the legalization of marijuana, but when the state passed it, overwhelmingly I accept it and support it. And I think the federal government should not act like it's prohibition again, and should go ahead and legalize recreational marijuana.
Penny Ronning, your rebuttal.
Thank you. I think the voters of Montana have decided what they want, and I do support that. I do believe that cannabis should be removed from a Schedule I drug at the federal level and should be regulated at the federal level.
Thank you. Congressman Rosendale?
I find it fascinating when my opponents say that they're ready to ignore federal law in this circumstance and in other circumstances we should all abide by it so very strictly. It's a federal law. Marijuana is a Schedule I drug. It is illegal, and to be passing laws at the state level that allow it to be consumed without having good data to investigate the problems that it's causing our young people, I think is very dangerous.
Thank you. Mr. Buchanan, your
Well, the
response.
question was, would you support legalizing it? None of us are talking about ignoring the law, Matt. I think most of us are law-abiding citizens. We're talking about sitting in your chair and making some progress from a lawmaking standpoint.
Thank you. Ashley, you have the next question for Penny Ronning.
Yeah, Ms. Ronning, millions of Americans owe a collective $1.7 trillion in student loans, a figure that has doubled over the last 10 years and disproportionately affects women, people of color, and low-income students. Do you support student loan forgiveness, and can you talk about why or why not?
Thank you for that question. I do support student loan forgiveness. When I first went to college after I graduated high school in 1980 from Billings West High, I went to Montana State University, and at that point my tuition was affordable. I could work a job and help pay for that tuition. When I returned to school in my mid-30s, a number of years later, the tuition had dramatically changed. When I went and got my master's degree in my 40s, that tuition had dramatically changed. What we have now is a tuition so high that that folks cannot get out from underneath it, especially young people and those non-traditional students that already have responsibilities, whether it's a mortgage or child care, that is in addition to that educational loan that they've got now. We need to be able to afford education in our country. That's what's good for our country, and it's what's good for our citizenry.
Thank you. Congressman Rosendale, your rebuttal.
Thank you so much. This loan forgiveness program is a slap in the face to everyone who paid their student loans off, who took 3 jobs on when they were going to college, whose parents took 3 jobs on so that they could pay for their students' education. For those 50% of the population across our nation that never went to college. This is not forgiveness. This is nothing more than redirection. They didn't absorb those loans, but they're going to have to pay them off if the president has his way. And that's just wrong.
Thank you. Mr. Buchanan, your response.
I oppose President Biden's student loan forgiveness. I think it's the wrong time to put another 600 to 800 million in inflation. I think the economy is overstimulated. When I was a chairman of the banking board in the 1980s, we restructured loans. We worked with interest rates to save banks because it was a very serious point in our economy. And I think that that kind of thing is what you do with student loans. I do not believe that a couple earning $250,000 should be granted forgiveness.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan. And Ms. Ronning, your response.
To save banks, how about we save people? How about we actually work to allow people, especially young people, to develop equity, to come out from underneath the burden because they went and got an education? To save banks, how about we work to save people?
Thank you. Congressman Rosendale, my question is about guns. Why are you supporting the repeal of the federal tax on guns, ammunition, and archery equipment, which funds conservation and hunters' education programs through the Pittman-Robertson Act?
I really appreciate this question because it's been floating around. What we would do is the legislation that's proposed is actually guarantee a more constant stream of revenue for the conservation programs, for Pittman-Robertson specifically. It's been averaging anywhere between $550 to $750 million a year. This piece of legislation would guarantee $800 million a year, so that's a win-win for Pittman-Robertson. But additionally, it would remove that tax from your ammunition and from your firearms. That is the only right that we have that gets taxed at the federal level. It's just unbelievable. And if the federal government is able to place that kind of a tax on your rights, they certainly are able to tax it out of reach of the individual who wants to purchase this. And we've seen several proposals coming through Congress right now from, again, the Democrat Party that would propose to do just that, to continue to raise those taxes so that your guns and firearms are out of reach.
Thank you. Mr. Buchanan, your response.
Well, Matt, you're sponsoring a bill to do away with Pittman-Robertson has angered fishing, hunting, conservationists across the state. It's led to millions of dollars being given to the state for a number of hunting and angling projects. It helps fish, wildlife, and parks. Even the NRA, Matt, is against you on this one. It's worked for almost a century, and it's helped me because the Montana Sportsmen's Alliance just supported me because of your action on Pittman-Robertson.
Thank you. And Ms. Ronning, your response.
Thank you. So Matt Rosendale just told us that he opposes government putting a tax on your right. But just a short time ago, he said he supports government being in a woman's womb. I think that's all I need to say.
Thank you, Congressman Rosendale.
Just to clarify, this is not eliminating Pittman-Robertson, and that is the rhetoric of the left. They would try to sway the conservation voters to think that that's what was going to happen here. Again, if you read the language of the legislation, you will see that it guarantees a larger stream of revenue for Pittman-Robertson. I've seen many and have approved many shooting ranges across the state working with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and utilizing Pittman-Robertson funds, so I do understand how important they are, and am very supportive of that act.
Thank you. Ashley Nurbervig, you have a question for Mr. Gary Buchanan.
Mr. Buchanan, You've talked a lot about the economy being your strong suit. Now, can you talk a little bit more about what you did and didn't support in Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, and what are some additional steps you'd like to take, if elected, to reduce inflation?
Well, I'm a businessman. I have a background in finance. I chaired the banking board, as I mentioned. I've chaired the Board of Investments. I think what I would bring to a U.S. Congress seat is an experience in the marketplace and with banking and finance. I support Chairman Powell. I think he was Trump's best appointment. I'm glad Joe Biden reappointed him. What the Fed an attempt to stop our inflation from not being like the 1980s. Again, when I was banking chairman. In the 1980s, I met a lady in Weibo the other day that paid 17% for her mortgage. At my investment firm, we were selling CDs at 16 to 18%. We have to, and it's painful, but we have to support this effort to retain inflation and not go back into stagflation like we did in the 80s.
Thank you. Ms. Ronning, your rebuttal.
Thank you. I appreciate that Gary's reminding all of us that he was part of the banking system and the commerce system in the 1980s, which is what we're living out now, is that trickle-down economics, which has proven to have failed our state, proven to have failed our economy of the country.
Thank you. Mr. Rosendale, your response.
Sure. The Inflation Acceleration Act, as I call it, pumped another $400 billion of new spending into the economy. That is not how you slow down inflation. If Gary's such a great businessman, he would certainly recognize that when you're in a deep hole, the first thing you have to do is stop digging. We had $5 trillion of new spending that was put on the debt since the Democrats took over, and we have to stop this. I do, again, repeat, he was certainly supportive of those 87,000 new IRS agents, though.
Thank you. And Mr. Buchanan, your response here.
Well, I think the IRS is going to retire about 80,000 people in the next 5 years. That's all I can say. I have not publicly supported 87,000. I think we do need an increase in IRS. I think that the Fed is doing a good job on the monetary front. It's time for the Republicans and Democrats to cease spending, and I think the subject of deficit spending only comes up when the other parties in charge of committees in the legislature, and I think both Republicans and Democrats spend too much money.
I have a question for Penny Ronning. Ms. Ronning, the missing murdered Indigenous persons issue is a big topic in Montana and with human trafficking all across the country. What do you think the federal government's response? What do you think of the federal government's response, and how can it improve in this area?
Thank you, and thank you for that question. And I'll share that I am the co-founder of the largest anti-human trafficking task force in the state of Montana. We work at the local, the state, and the federal level. One of the things that we're working on right now is the Earn It Act. I work with both Senator Blumenthal and Senator Graham's office on this bill. One of the areas that the federal government needs to address is online safety for children. One of the most dangerous places for children to be right now is on the internet when they're unsupervised. Attacking the ways that predators reach out to children needs to be a priority in our government right now.
Thank you. Mr. Rosendale, your rebuttal.
Sure. I had Secretary Holland in front of me in Natural Resource Committee hearing, and I specifically asked her about this and asked her what can we do about the murdered and missing Indigenous women across the nation in our different reservations and tribes, and she really hasn't given me a lot of work, but I've been traveling around to our own reservations and to different states, and the big thing we must focus on is to have better collaboration between the federal law enforcement agencies and the tribal law enforcement agencies so we can resolve these issues.
Thank you. Mr. Buchanan, your response.
Well, I've met with tribal chairmen on the subject, and I think a lot needs to be done at the level that Penny Ronning mentioned and at the level that Matt mentioned. A lot more needs to be done. It's a serious problem.
Ms. Ronning, you have the final word on this topic.
Thank you. Matt Rosendale's voted against every piece of anti-human trafficking legislation that is hit both at the state level and the federal level. Every single piece he has voted against it. I have passed human trafficking legislation at the state level and have worked to pass it at the federal level. I've also passed it at the municipal level. I'm proud to say that as a Democrat, I've passed legislation in a fully controlled Republican legislative body. It can be done, and I'm proud of the work that we've done.
Thank you. Russ Riesinger, you have a question for Congressman Rosendale.
Yeah, Congressman, you voted no on every major Biden administration bill, including some that would provide much-needed infrastructure and other benefits here in Montana. What would you say to your critics who say that you haven't done anything positive while in office?
I would say that they haven't looked at my record, Ross. What you'll see is on the Veterans Affairs Committee, I worked to bring in reforms on the IT system that they have, which is spending billions and billions of dollars so that we could redirect that back to benefits for our veterans. I supported the PACT Act, although I know that Ms. Ronning would like to talk about the first versions that came through. Actually, that's how the legislative body works. There's several versions that go back and forth, and once we were finally able to refine it to the point that it was not only going to provide those benefits to the veterans, but also identify different diseases as they went forward to make sure that they didn't have to come back to Congress again, and to make sure that they had the resources necessary to handle this additional workload that was coming through. We were actually able to bring everyone together and get that signed into law. We've done a lot of work on again, mental health, supported many pieces of mental health investments as well.
Thank you. Mr. Buchanan, your response.
I think it's clear, Matt, that you haven't really passed anything of substance. I was just in Havre 2 weeks ago, and you're voting against $100 million for the Milk River irrigation project, and I didn't even know about it, but I was told that by dozens of Havre residents. So you got to put your money where your mouth is, and you got to help Montanans.
Thank you. Ms. Ronning?
Thank you. Matt, you just voted yesterday against the help for veterans who are in need of food security. You voted against almost every single thing that comes to do with veterans, but you take credit for the legislation that gets passed by Senator Tester and the Democrats. But you have voted against everything, and I would agree with Gary in regard to the Milk River. You did vote against that, and that is the water resource for everyone along that high line from Havre to Chinook.
Mr. Rosendale?
Sure. I appreciate it. I do put my money where my mouth is, but I'm a very good steward of the taxpayers' dollars. And when we start looking at legislation that has the Green New Deal involved in it, it has the gender sensitivity training in it, when we see that it provides for additional expansions of government, we had $5 trillion worth of new spending that was piled up on the back of taxpayers across this nation last year. And that is not why I was sent to Washington, D.C. I think that the people across the state of Montana have asked me to stand up and be their voice and not to just sign off on a piece of legislation so that they can get a crumb off of the table.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and we need to keep it quick. So, Russ, you're going to ask Mr. Rosendale.
Okay, Mr. Rosendale, what do you feel like is the biggest threat facing America right now?
I think the biggest threat facing America right now is the invasion that's taking place on our southern border, because we're not talking about just the 250,000 to 300,000 people a month that we know of that are coming into our country. But I've been down there 3 times, and it is an absolute humanitarian crisis. We also have 40,000 approximately illegals coming in a month that are unidentified. They're coming in wearing ghillie suits. They're wearing carpet shoes. And if it is so easy to come into our country and be welcomed in and released into the country, waiting for your asylum hearing for up to 8 years, why in the world would you sneak in? And then we have the fentanyl and the human trafficking that becomes a major problem.
Thank you. And Mr. Buchanan?
I think the biggest threat to our nation is Russia, and in my closing remarks, I'll talk a little bit more about that. We need more border guards at the barrier, and we need more border guards to keep people from either climbing over the wall or digging under the wall, because the wall is a sieve, and we need more people.
Thank you. Ms. Ronning?
I think the biggest threat to our country right now is the threat on our democracy, what we've seen internally with the insurrection, what we see with the divide amongst Americans. I think the biggest threat we're seeing globally is the fight on democracy and how we as Americans are supporting one another in that fight against democracy.
Thank you. We need to get to our closing statements. You're going to each have 90 seconds. Mr. Buchanan, you are first.
I filed when shame overplaced embarrassment. And when embarrassment was replaced by shame was when Matt voted against commending the police force, which saved the Capitol and likely his colleagues from an insurrection. When he was one of 3 in the entire House to vote against supporting Ukraine. Since then, Matt has voted against supporting NATO. He's voted against supporting Sweden and Finland joining NATO. And the embarrassment continues. Yesterday, he voted against providing military assistance once again to Ukraine. I think we need in this state, as I've gone across the state, I had 460 signature gatherers, gaining 15,000 signatures. I've been door to door. People are worried about our democracy. They're tired of the two-party system. They're tired of the bickering between the two parties. And I think that they notice now that that the room for an independent in this state and nationally, but particularly in this state, there's an 8-mile highway down the center of Montana politics, and my 2 honorable opponents just keep making the highway wider. Independents are the fastest growing part of the Montana electorate, and I'm your man.
Thank you. Ms. Ronning, your closing statement.
Thank you. So my encouragement to Montanans is to look to our own state. My memories growing up are of right here in Montana. I went to public education here, grew up in Billings. My father was a restaurant owner. My mother was a federal government employee. Montanans have a value system that raised me. When we look to Montanans, we look to the working class in many ways. My encouragement to Montanans is to stop electing millionaires. They don't live like the rest of us live. They don't live like 99% of the country lives. In Montana, we need someone that understands the issues that Montanans are facing on a daily basis, that understands the struggle with child care, with health care, with affordable housing, with what we're facing within our agriculture system right now of possibly losing our family farms and ranches. To my right, we heard tonight that his care is about the banks. The type of legislation that Gary Buchanan worked at the state level, led us into the underfunding of our public schools. Matt has said that we can't pass anything because he's in a minority party. I proved that you can pass good legislation that benefits the whole, even if you are of the minority party.
Thank you. And Mr. Rosendale, your final statements.
Thank you all very much for hosting this tonight. I think it's great that the general public can hear the ideas amongst us and how they differ. We have seen over the last 20 months how the Democrat single-party rule has all but ruined our country. We have higher interest rates, we have higher crime rates, we have higher grocery bills, we have higher fuel bills, and it is becoming crippling to all of the households. The kitchen tables across the country are having these discussions every single night on how they're going to make ends meet. The only thing that isn't higher, unfortunately, are folks' retirement accounts, their 401k. They're plummeting. They're absolutely plummeting. I have introduced legislation to address these needs. This single-party control, Democrat Party control, has blocked us from advancing any of these. Whether we're talking about the immigration reforms that I put forward, the health care reforms that I put forward, the VA reforms that I put forward to help our veterans, the agricultural reforms to make sure that we can harvest our timber and our oil and gas and get us not just energy independence but dominance again, because that's not just good for our economy, it's good for our national security. And if we can gain control of the House back again, what we're going to focus on is making sure that we have a strong economy, a safe nation, a future built on freedom, and an accountable government. And that's why I would ask for your vote as we go into the November elections. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to the candidates for taking time out and making the trip to Great Falls. Republican Congressman Matt Rosendale, the incumbent, Democratic candidate Penny Ronning, and also the independent candidate Gary Buchanan. Thank you so much. Thank you also to our panelists, Russ Riesinger from KTVQ in Billings and the MTN senior political reporter Ashley Nurbevig. Thank you so much. And remember to go out and vote, folks. And this debate will be available on the MTN streaming platform, so look for it there. We thank you all for watching. Have a great night.